Welcome. Welcome. We are so pleased that you all are with us this evening. If you'd be so kind as to share with us where you are from in the chat. Welcome. Thank you so much for your timeliness.
Oh my goodness, people are coming in a hurry.
Yeah, very quickly. Welcome. So many are connecting. Thank you all so much for being with us. If you'd be so kind as to share with us where you are from, feel free to place it in the chat when you are ready. Evanston, Illinois, welcome. Carol from Portland, Oregon, welcome. Oh, Connecticut, Bloomfield, Connecticut, welcome. Seattle, welcome. It's going so fast. Hartfield, Connecticut, welcome. California, Florida, New Jersey, Nevada, Las Vegas, Nevada, welcome. So thankful that you are with us. San Diego, oh, hello. Honolulu, let me go back up here. Yes, welcome. Thank you all so much for being with us. Colorado.
There was somebody from Hawaii.
Yes. I was trying to find the name again. It went by so fast, but yes, I definitely saw Hawaii. And then Fort Lauderdale, Florida, welcome. There you are, Faye, welcome. Colorado, Hawaii again, welcome. New York, New York. Berkeley, California. Okay, Virginia, welcome. A pleasure to see some new faces and faces who are with us very often. Minnesota, welcome. Boston, Massachusetts, welcome.
In Atlanta, there's someone from my church, Florence. Hello.
Can't forget Atlanta, Alaska, welcome. Every time I say that on the different programs, Nancy, I get very, very thrilled and excited all over again. Welcome. Bradenton, Florida. You all, we will be beginning in a few minutes. We really appreciate your patience as others are still coming in. Yes, welcome, Rebecca, Bradenton, Florida. Kind comments. California, welcome. Hopkins, Minnesota. I don't think I've heard of Hopkins, but it's a pleasure to have you, Mari. Oakland, California. Welcome, Fran. Thank you so much for being here. We'll begin in another minute here. You all blew me away. I'm trying to scroll up because I skipped over so many. Hartford, Connecticut, welcome. San Diego. Athens, Georgia, welcome, Ruth Elizabeth. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Yes, welcome, Jeanette. Thank you for being here. Yes, from All Saints. Okay, you all, great evening. My name is Dominique Hardy, and I'm the program manager for the Center for Racial Healing, where Dr. Catherine Meeks is our amazing executive director. And we send you a resounding welcome as we engage in this conversation tonight on celebrating Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And it is very important to the center that we are faithful in addressing issues and racist structures concerning all people. And so we are thankful that you are with us this evening. And yes, for those who are coming in, welcome. Still see some more. Welcome, Donna. And we hope that you all will find this evening to be educational, inspiring, and that you will be able to take away the knowledge from this evening and our incredible panelists for your everyday lives to do work where you are. And so we're going to hop right into the program. Welcome, Chris. We're going to hop right into it, you all. And yes, it will be recorded. The recording will be sent out to you in within 2 days of this program. It will also be on the center's YouTube page for those who are asking. If for any reason we experience any technological errors or issues with technology, which we do not foresee, take a deep breath, sign out, sign back in using the same registration link, and give us about 3 to 5 minutes to reconnect. We really appreciate your grace in that regards. And so we are going to go ahead and introduce our incredible panelists for this evening. And we will start, and while I am saying them, feel free to raise your hand, esteemed panelists, as your name is called. We're going to start with the Right Reverend Diana Akiyama. She is the Bishop for the Diocese of Oregon. Also, we have Mr. Alan Murray. He is the co-chair for the Diocese of Oregon deputation to the 80th General Convention and co-chair of the Asian Caucus of Deputies of Color. And we're so thankful that both of you are with us. Also, we have Canon Barbara Okamoto Bach. She is a facilitator of anti-racism work in the Diocese of New Jersey. Welcome. We also have the Reverend Joseph Kundif, who is the curate for St. Luke's East Hampton. And then last but not least, we have the Reverend Shanta Bahan. She is the interim chaplain for middle school and upper school of All Saints Episcopal School in Fort Worth. And you all, they are going to share additional information about their ways of service in the world because there are so many panelists, it is so much that these esteemed panelists are doing. And we just really appreciate you all's way of being in the world. And we do honor you this evening. And so tonight, you all, as we proceed with these questions, please know, participants, that you are a part of us. We are going to be asking you to place any questions that you have in the appropriate box. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And at 7 o'clock or around that time frame, we will be answering your questions as well. But we're going to start off with some basic questions that I know are burning in the hearts of many. And so, but before we do that, feel free, in the order that I just introduced you, to share a little bit more about yourself if you desire to do so. And so we're going to start with the Right Reverend Akiyama.
So I think your first question was, what Asian group do I identify with? My father is Japanese. My mother is a combination of Dutch, Norwegian, and some Native American. But the place where I grew up as a child was in a Japanese American community, and that is definitely the community that I identify with, and the community that those who were not Japanese American identified me with. So that goes to the question we'll talk about later. I grew up in Oregon, which is a traditionally predominantly very white state. And I think those experiences have definitely left an imprint on me and have shaped the way in which I look at the world in terms of race and racism. My election to become the Bishop of the Diocese of Oregon made me the first Asian American woman to become a bishop in the Episcopal Church. Although I don't know if that is the biggest distinction amongst the people in the Diocese of Oregon. I think the biggest distinction is the first Native Oregonian to be a bishop in this diocese.
Incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. Anyone else can hop in as you feel so compelled. What is your ethnicity or cultural heritage is the question.
Yeah, I would jump in. So hi, my name is Alan Murray, and I live in the Portland metro area, and I'm also a parishioner at Trinity Cathedral. My ethnic background was Chinese. Both my parents immigrated from China. Not my parents, actually, my grandparents immigrated from China to Singapore and Malaysia. So my father was actually born in Malaysia and came to Singapore, which is just across the bridge after the World War II ended in 1945, and my mom was born in Singapore. So I always grew up as a ethnic majority, actually, in Singapore. 70% of the population in Singapore are Chinese, and the remaining were Malays and Indians and Eurasians. So I came to the United States first as a graduate student, and many other opportunities have started to open up, and I stayed. So I've been here for over 20 years now, and this is when I start to experience what it is like to be a minority living in a foreign land. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Awesome, thank you.
I'm Barbie Okamoto Bach, and I am Japanese American. I am third generation Japanese American. We say that is Sansei. I'm also a third generation Episcopalian. My Issei grandparents, the first generation immigrants, and my Nisei second generation parents were ministered to by Father Kano, who is known as the Saint of Nebraska. And he was added to Holy Women and Holy Men by General Convention resolution in 2015. His saint day, Bishop Diana, is October 24th. I also lived in Japan for 3 years, from 2000 to 2003, when my husband's job took us there. Our kids attended an English-speaking international school, and I learned about my heritage in my grandparents' homeland. And later on, I will talk about some interesting history of the Japanese immigrant community in Nebraska. But what I do in the Episcopal Church is I'm a lay leader in the Diocese of New Jersey. I organize against racism in the church, in communities, schools, and workplaces. I instruct anti-racism training. I advocate for the study of history to support reparative justice for the harmful legacy of slavery and enslaving African people in this country. I'm co-chair of the Reparations Commission. I'm a repeat deputy to General Convention and a member of the Asian Caucus of Deputies of Color to General Convention. I organize environmental action to heal God's creation in the global climate crisis. And the Episcopal Church makes clear that these are the values of the church and of followers of Jesus.
Wow, such important work, all of you. Thank you. Who else would like to share?
Well, I can't quite follow that kind of a resume that Ken and Barbie has, but I'm Joseph Cundiff. I'm a curate, so recently ordained priest, honing my skills with the Diocese of Long Island. And my ethnic background is Korean. My mother's Korean, immigrated to the States in the 1970s. That's how I identify. Similar to Bishop Akiyama, I grew up in mostly in Indiana and Alabama, very white dominant areas. And then similar to Ken and Barbie, I lived in Korea for 3 years, able to get in touch with my heritage and culture a lot more before finding my way to New York and Long Island.
Thank you so much for sharing.
I'd be happy to share. I'm Shanta Bahan. I am a newly ordained priest through the Diocese of Massachusetts. I've been serving with the Episcopal Diocese of Dallas and the Episcopal Church in North Texas that hopefully will soon become part of Diocese of Texas, and came and served in Texas during a pandemic. Had never been to Texas before. I moved here for work. And so I'm very open to adventures, much like my parents were. My parents came to the United States from Pakistan, so I'm Pakistani American. My parents were immigrants to the United States during the late 1960s, early 1970s, when there was much more openness to immigration from South Asia. And so I feel incredibly blessed to be able to be in the United States because my parents made certain brave decisions at a certain time in their life. And so I too have been reared mostly in New York and Massachusetts. I was born and reared in New York, and that's where I went to school. For the most part, my life has been on the East Coast. I've grown up mostly in white dominant communities, but also felt a desire to connect with my family in Pakistan. So I was traveling back and forth once a year to visit with them and to do some work there. And up until the time that I entered the ordination process. And so I'm very grateful to be able to be here. I'm one of, I think, less than a handful of women of Pakistani descent who are ordained as priests in the world, because Pakistani Christians are a very, very small group of people. And then in the United States, I am very grateful to be the first person of Pakistani descent to complete an entire canonical process in the United States in TEC. And so I hope I can help give more hope to others in the process going forward. And I can share a little bit more as we go through the other questions as well.
Absolutely incredible. Thank you for sharing that. I also really appreciated how you all not just shared where your ethnic or cultural heritage, where you are from, but also where you grew up, because that does play a big part, I think, in this conversation, so that people have a framework. And so thank you so much for sharing. And Reverend Shanta, I actually did not know that, a part of that about you. So that was very, very profound, I think, in the example that all of you, frankly, are having on this generation and on the church and community at large. So our question here on the table next is, please describe the main issues and/or misconceptions that you feel are facing Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States today.
I'll be happy to get started, and I'm just going to mention it because I'm sure the rest of the panelists will have other things to say as well. I think one of the big things for Asian Americans is that we has been considered as the moral minorities, which means that we are expected to be docile, to be compliant, to be, not speak your mind. And that is further from the truth. And with a lot of Asian Americans that I've met, in fact, even in the political landscape, President Obama actually won 73% of the Asian Americans' votes, and 63% of the Asian Americans actually voted for Biden. So this is not a population that is very quiet. They do have something to say. The other thing that I think is really crucial to remember is that racism is not black and white issue. Very often when we talk about racism, there is always this very black and white thinking in terms of race relationship. But racism is really more than just black and white, because when we start to look at racism from a black and white perspective, we really forgot about the other people of color, the Latino, the indigenous, and the Asian people. So I always remind people in my context when we start having conversation about racism is that this is more than just a black and white. It may have started as a black and white issue in this country, but it has moved beyond black and white issues. And I think the third thing is that that I would like to say is that we are not a monolithic culture or ethnicity. Just as represented on this panelist, we have people who are, Japanese American descent and Chinese, but we also have people from South Asia and also Southeast Asian. Sometimes I do have a little bit of identity crisis because ethnically I identify as Chinese, but I had never even been to China. So when when I first arrived in America, I was a little bit hesitant when people asked me, what is your ethnicity? Because if I say I'm Chinese, they thought that I was from China, but I have never even been to China. I wasn't born in China. But I was born in Singapore, and but my grandparents were Chinese, and so the Asian culture is really, the ethnicity is not monolithic, and so just to be mindful, there's such a variety of expression and background and richness in it. So so that's what I have to say about some of the main issue and misconception.
One of the things I thought about, Alan, as you were talking, is that model minority myth, and the way in which it really shapes stereotypes about Asians, particularly around economic issues, and stereotypes that Asian Americans have figured out how to make it. And so we're all clumped into this category of, well, they're fine. So, which is part of that model minority myth. They've made it, so we don't need to worry about them. And I think it's important to point out that the vast majority of Asian immigrants were allowed into the country to be cheap labor. And so the economic roots of racism are, the reason many of us are sitting here together talking, and it is often the motivator for a lot of the violence that has been visited upon Asian Americans. And I refer specifically here to Japanese Americans in Hood River, Oregon, where I grew up, and the Portland area as well, during the times leading up to World War II, and certainly during the war, a lot of property was stolen from Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans in the Pacific Northwest, because particularly in the area where I grew up, the Japanese farmers were so much more successful than the white farmers. And there was all kinds of paranoia and bizarre ideas about the Japanese farmers keeping secrets and having these special seeds and fertilizers shipped over from Japan, and they weren't sharing them with their white neighbor orchardists. I mean, it was crazy. But that feeds into this whole idea that we can bring you in here to improve our economic position, but the minute you start prospering from that, we're going to find a way to put you down. And my father said, from as early as I can remember, had always said to us that he felt like the prime motivation for the relocation of Japanese citizens was economic, that there was a great sense of feeling threatened by the prosperity of the Japanese immigrants.
Thank you.
And the farming history in Nebraska was, they kept trying to put in laws so that the Japanese farmers could not own land. And then when that was blocked for a while, but then there was always a fight over water rights. And that was really essential for just the unfair practices of allocating water rights that are essential for farming in Nebraska. It always was a lot of fear and mistrust, I think. And one problem is that Asian immigrants are always seen as the forever foreigner, the inscrutable, suspicious, and a lot of that can be broken down if you just develop genuine relationships and get to know people. You'll understand them better. The other misconceptions are that there's the competition for jobs, that they're unfit to work the land, unfit to own the land. And then that how many times do you get asked, do you speak English? I get asked that all the time. And one thing is that this country has never addressed these old characterizations of people from other countries, and set the record straight. One of the problems with the way that this country was set up is to put non-white people in the other category. And so we have a lot of work to do to undo those structures that that separate us. I think the issues that we have here in the upper, Reverend Joseph, in the New York City area, are the physical hate crimes and harassment and anti-Asian hate is just, it's totally out of control. It's very scary. It's my Asian friends in New York City can't get a taxi. And also that vulnerable people are being physically attacked and their lives are in danger. So we're really tired of it. I know everybody's tired of COVID, but there's a lot of scapegoating and blaming Asians. And I've been walking on the street and somebody rolls down their window and says, "Go back to your country and take the virus with you." And that happens. Yeah. And I've also found that I can look in the mirror and notice that you can still tell I'm Asian when I'm wearing a face mask. And so there are just, I don't know, but people are just acting out on this. And so I can't get served at the post office. The postal clerks don't serve me. The cashiers have walked away when I'm trying to give them my money. And it's been a long couple years. I just saw a statistic yesterday that from 2021 to 2022, the number of hate crimes, anti-Asian hate crimes, doubled the number that were recorded in 2020. And we all know that not all of these incidents are recorded and counted.
I would also share, just following up on what others have shared, that I think that there's an element of invisibility and also hypervisibility. There's a way in which in a group experience just being hypervisible, because often if you're navigating certain dominant spaces where there's an ethnicity that's dominant and one is within a less dominant space, that yes, very visible, but then there's also an element of feeling very invisible in processes, the story can be very invisible. A person's personal narrative can be very invisible because it's very unfamiliar and it's not well represented. And for whatever reason, when we are the only person, I don't want to speak for everyone else, I'll speak for myself. When I'm the only person in a space and I'm the only person sharing a very unique story, it's very easy sometimes to feel that it's being dismissed, but I'm not even sure that it's being dismissed. I think that it's just hard to maybe hear and recognize the story and to make the story visible in some way, because it may be so unfamiliar and in some ways maybe not believable. I don't want to say that. In some ways it's just not credible because it's not a dominant story. It's not a dominant narrative. And I'm sounding probably a little bit more I probably need to give specifics, which I can give a specific maybe later on when we're answering other questions. But, I think for people who are going through the ordination process or going through certain processes, there's a way in which your story can be very unique. And an example for me would be that my family was actually Hindu about 3 generations ago. And so it's so unfamiliar for people that's actually a very unique part of my culture that impacted what I studied as an undergrad undergraduate, the reasons why I wanted to learn more about my family's language, and I wanted to study Sanskrit and study South Asian languages and literatures, not because I was questioning my own faith, but because I wanted to delve deeper into my own personal heritage and history and see the ways in which my call to the priesthood may have been similar to a family member's call to the Hindu priesthood. And so there's a way in which that story can become so complex when it's a unique cultural story that it's really, it's difficult for people to figure out how that integrates because it's not a common narrative. And some people will gravitate toward it and will ask more questions, but in general, I think it's just easier to maybe leave that part of a person's personal narrative in a certain space that's untouched.
Thank you.
Oh, the only thing I'll add to that, I think, is that in terms of the invisibility of our stories, and a point that Alan had mentioned earlier is one of the issues I think is on top of what everyone else has shared here. One of the issues I think is facing AAPIs today is the problem of the monolith of that block of what it means to be AAPI, when there's so many of us that have such unique and different stories from all of our different heritages and cultures and ethnicities, and even just looking at the different timelines of who we are in the States. It's unfair in the way that it's all lumped together in this under this one umbrella, AAPI. And sure, that has a lot of value, and it has held a lot of value politically. And we certainly have to give thanks to our ancestors and forebears who came before us to form that and to earn a lot of political weight and respect and move things forward. But it does have some downsides to it that are issues for APIs today.
I think these are very, very profound sharings that you all are doing so courageously. There were so many brilliant points brought up, particularly about the monolith issue and what I believe Reverend Shanta was saying about the invisibility factor. And I think that the lumping together has a lot to do with that. And so I really appreciate how you all not only shared what some of the myths are and the different issues, but also I even heard a solution within that, which I know we'll get to later. But I believe that Canon Bach said about the building of genuine relationships, and so thank you all for sharing that. We're going to move on to the next question. How has racism impacted you personally and as well as in your professional journey, if you are comfortable sharing?
I can go again. So, in fact, just a week ago, Oregonians, which is our local newspaper, had a article about how there's an increase of AAPI hate and discrimination rising in Oregon. And so this is just a week ago that Asian businesses in Portland area have been hit by a rash of vandalism and break-ins. And we are also right now in the cycle of a election. Primary is coming up in a week. And we have a AAPI candidate who is running for the Metro seat, and this particular person also got a lot of disparaging comments about his qualification, and they were telling him that you brought the virus here type of message. And there's also reports of Asian students in middle school in Portland has been racially taunted by their classmates, and more of the half of the respondents of the survey in Asian Oregonians identify race-based harassment as a serious community issues right now. So this is just the context of where I live right now. And like I mentioned earlier, I was not always raised in a context that I was a minority. So since I arrived in the United States over 20 years ago, I have experienced all kinds of discrimination from like what Barbie was saying earlier, like do you speak English, type of discrimination that which is more blatant, to microaggression that you can experience in churches. Because we are all good Episcopalian, right? So we will not be outright racist. So we will just be a little bit more passive aggressive in a form of microaggression. And also the one of the experience that I have since COVID was that I personally have asthma, and so which means that little bit of allergy will trigger cough and all that. And you have to be really careful how much you cough in public, because people is going to look at you, or people just stare at you down because you, like Barbie, if I wear a mask, I still look Asian. And people just really give you their sting eyes when you are coughing. And one of the most dramatic kind of experience was that, as you can tell, my last name is Murray, which is definitely not a Chinese last name. That was my husband's last name. So after we got married, we decided to change my last name, not because I was wanting the white privilege types of last name to go along with it, but it was just because we're in the process of adoption and we just did not want to do hyphenated names. And so for just practical reason, we decided to just choose one. And so you had no idea that the doors of opportunity started to open up when I sent in resume for job interviews. Previously, you will not get any people paying attention, because I think for, especially for Asian, your last name is really hard to conceal. If you're Japanese, Korean, Chinese, you do have a very unique last name. A lot of my African American friends or people from African descent, because of slavery, some of them has assimilated, had taken up white names. And so it's a little bit harder to kind of differentiate that. But for Asian, it's really easy to distinguish whether you're Asian just by looking at your resume. And the number of doors that open up and interviews that I've been called into was just remarkable the minute I changed my last name. So I don't think that is a coincidence. I do think that we still are a very racist society. So those are some of my own personal experiences. So I'm sure other of the panelists might have some other that they want to share their thoughts on.
I often think back and wonder how much privilege I've been afforded in my life for carrying my father's family name, a very white name. When I know I can apply for a job or submit my resume or send an email, people see this a white name, but then when I present physically, I'm not exactly the most white person. That has shaped me growing up in places like Indiana and Alabama, and not being white or black, but being the other, as Ken and Barbie had mentioned. And I think it played some role in my professional or vocational path as well. When I found the Episcopal Church in 2012, after growing up in other churches, when I moved to New York and was simply looking for a Korean American church that I thought was a good community, a good place to pray, and with some good people. And that's what I found. And then a few years later, felt a call to ordained ministry that, as I had been fed through that community, then part of the call was for me to also feed others through a community that could feed me, and for all of who I am, and speak to that and address that.
And then there's also the downside of diversity when people are trying to color add color to their organization, then you get invited in as sort of a token or somebody who can make them look better.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. I think that there's a way in which sometimes in institutions, when we're the first person of color somewhere or in a certain role, there's a way in which I personally am learning to discern between whether this is my call to be there for a specific reason, for a specific time, for a specific purpose, and then to create the structures around that to support me personally. In terms of other folks of color in my life with whom I can talk and have conversations and process with a therapist, spiritual director, and others. And then there are other times I think I've learned from the experience of being in places that maybe had not done the work that needed to be done before I entered into the system. And I realized at that point, there may not be the space for me to be able to participate in maybe God's transformative work within that system if work hasn't already been done and there's a mutual invitation from the space and a sense of call from me to the space, being very aware of what has preceded my entry into that system. So have folks been having conversations about diversity? Have they been having conversations about the challenges of diversity and racism and microaggressions and all of that? How long has that been going on? Who's initiating those conversations? How have they been transformative? Where are we in the system in terms of those conversations? And so I've entered into systems where not a lot of that work has been done and I knew it, but also knew I was going to be there for a short period of time. And so I share that, sometimes it is a call into some of those spaces, but then I also have felt very strongly that there are places of risk and places of safety for me. And if I'm in a place of risk and I'm entering into that place of risk, I need to have other places of safety so that I can grow, but also be affirmed and feel like I've got spaces where I can sort of process some of the things that are going on with other people who are processing those things as well. And with respect to that question about how racism has impacted you in your personal professional journey, I was reared in a church that was very conservative, and I'm not in that same space now. I would consider myself to be more progressive, but there was a whole community of people at our church that it was a white dominant church. And there was a group of people there that would not allow my brother, my sister, and me to be part of the youth group. And since then, I've actually learned a little bit about the ways in which we're buffered from trauma. And there were some amazing leaders at that church, the pastor and some women who were executives who did not have children, who took my brother, my sister, and me under their wing and really buffered us from the pain of what that experience could have been. And I'm so grateful for that, because as a potential leader in the church, having had a positive experience helps me to know how to do that for other people and to understand how that was helpful for me and identify some of the problematic dynamics in advance. They took us to other events. We were probably having more fun than the students who were in the youth group. And so I'm very grateful for that experience, because I think it's actually very rare to have had an experience like that in that type of community. But I feel as if that was God's way of really sheltering me and protecting me so that I could be in these spaces. And what I learned from that was, as long as the primary leader or major people in leadership are supportive of me, there's a lot that I can actually bear under. So I can manage, a lot of other dynamics that may not be as smooth, as long as the people who are primarily in charge and have the power to make major decisions are people who are supportive of me. And I think I learned that from childhood during that period of time.
Very profound. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else like to chime in before we go to the next one? I'm very touched by you all's transparency. At the center, we don't use the word safe space, we say brave space. And I think it's so critically important for everyone listening, even those who will watch the recording, to have an understanding of the type of experiences beyond generalizations. And so that is why I'm so deeply appreciative of this, because we, through this conversation, the framework, the foundation has been laid, but also you all are opening up your hearts and your lives so that people have a greater understanding. And I really appreciate what someone said in the very beginning. I keep going back to the fact that race relations, again, it's not just a Black and white issue at the center. It is very important to us that other voices are represented, Indigenous peoples, Asian Americans, obviously Pacific Islanders. I mean, the Latinx, Hispanic community, African American community, so forth and so on. And so that is the reason why we're having this conversation. So thank you for transparently sharing. And I do, you all see your questions in the chat. I mean, in the Q&A, we will get to those shortly. But the third question here is, what might it look like for the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement to honor the spiritualities of our Asian American and Pacific Islander siblings in public worship spaces without succumbing to the harmful urge to assimilate?
I'll speak, but I want to hear what Bishop Diana will say. But I think that in all things that the Episcopal Church does concerning its revisions to the prayer book, to liturgies, language, hymns, music, and considerations of the saints that we celebrate, I think the church should be circumspect and careful to not perpetuate whiteness and white culture as normal. I would like to see the Episcopal Church celebrate and honor people's origins and true selves. And the church must make itself relevant to young immigrants as well as to old traditions. I don't want to see pushing assimilation into a white system.
I really like the fact that the Episcopal Church is finding, I think it's a better way to honor those who've gone before us and have paved a way in a significant way as role models and as spiritual leaders. What you're referring to, Barbara, as our holy women and holy men that we're lifting up, I think it's much more powerful than the more traditional formula for how you become a saint. That it really is not about proving a miracle as much as it is being a role model for those who are on the edges and those who have struggled and people who have demonstrated the kind of clarity around their faith that allows them to be courageous in very difficult circumstances. I think, I'm a cradle Episcopalian, so I don't come with some attachment to traditional Japanese spirituality per se. My grandparents were Buddhist, and they converted after the FBI came and took my grandfather away because my grandfather believed that that was the best way for the family to appear to be more American, to be more accepted, and maybe not be persecuted. So my sense of spirituality is very much a combination of the ways in which I have been wounded and struggled in this very imperfect world of ours, and being an Episcopalian, including the old prayer book. I remember well the fight over the one that we now have. And I think the way in which the church is inviting conversation and and really examining, why are we calling ourselves Anglican? And what does that mean? And what does it assume about what's normative? And what does it assume about what is not normative, simply by using the term Anglican? And what is the history behind that? There's a lot of rich conversation that has begun around this, and I think we need to continue moving into that and doing it bravely, because investigating it and discovering things that may cause us to want to change some things is not necessarily a tearing down or a taking away or a sort of dilution of our tradition. It is opening it up, making it richer, more textured, more inclusive. And I think in a very real way, our liturgy, which I think is beautiful, is a way for people to be seen in a holy and spirit-filled way. The way in which we open up our liturgy to see and hear and embrace people who are not quote unquote Anglican, meaning English and white, it can only serve the church in a stronger, better way.
And just to piggyback on, Bishop Akiyama and Barbie comments about liturgy, I think I would like to see the Episcopal Church and all of us to be more curious. They're more curious about other people's origin and culture and heritage. I love the Episcopal liturgy, is what really grounds me. I love the sacraments, I love the liturgy, but we have to acknowledge that part of being in the Anglican communion and comes from an Anglican tradition also means the baggage of colonization that came with that. Singapore was a British colony since 1819 until the end of the war. For hundreds of years. And so the Anglican churches in Singapore definitely has the colonial effects of that period of time. But if you go, but one of the beauty of Anglican communion and Anglican churches and tradition also means diversity. Because of colonization, Anglican has so many different expressions in all regions of the world. So we are only experiencing one expression of worship in the United States. So I'm hoping that we as Episcopalian will be more curious about and dare to reimagine what that might look like if we were to open up our liturgy. It doesn't mean taking away something. And there are certain things that we can do right away. And that is like in our prayers of the people, is our prayers of the people really reflective of our diversity, the dreams that we have for our community? So if it's during especially Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year, when many Asian Americans celebrate, perhaps we can include that in our prayers of the people, a prayer of thanksgiving and blessings. One of the things I've been suggesting to legislative committees and when as they look at revision of prayer book is to also look at how our collects and our liturgy can have a fuller expression of different traditions and cultural heritage. I think in the Chinese culture, so as in many other Asian culture, the way we honor the dead, our ancestor, is really important. And the Roman Catholic actually has an office for the dead, but the Episcopal does not have an office for the dead. We do have the funeral rites and the administration of the last rites, but we do not actually have an office for the dead, which can be used actually in anniversaries of deaths and visiting grave sites service, those sort of things. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can really be true to who we are as Episcopalian, but also be more expansive in our imagination of how we include other culture.
following that, I was very excited to be able to be a part of the morning worship teams for General Convention. And so I'm not sure if Alan was one of the people who initiated this idea, but during General Convention this coming July, there are different groups that are responsible for leading morning prayer. And so we have the opportunity, which was a challenge in 4 meeting sessions with people we have never met before, to plan worship morning prayer that might represent the multiplicity of identities. And it's not perfect. It's definitely a work in progress. Thankfully, Bishop Akiyama is one of the people who's preaching for one of our worship sessions, and we're so grateful for that. But I learned so much in the process of doing this, because as we were sort of examining the different pieces of morning prayer, the liturgical elements, one of the things that I learned was that the Psalter was actually a unifying element across ecumenical communities in parts of South Asia, the Church of South India, the Church of Pakistan, which is unifying church. At one point, the church in Burma, that was the same thing. So across these different Christian denominations, it was a Psalter that was unifying. And so there is an entire liturgical expression, musical expression that incorporates the Psalter. And that's actually something that's very, very important to those who are Pakistani Christians, those who are Indian Christians, those who are Christians in other parts of South Asia. And it may also be that there's a legacy in Southeast Asia as well. And so that was something that I learned. And we were able to incorporate that. So there's a piece that we commissioned that will be present on the day that we are representing Asian American Pacific Islander morning prayer. And so, it's exciting to be able to go back and to learn a little bit more about our origins and our history, and also just to see how some of the churches in other countries that are unifying churches are doing such a great job of expressing ecumenical unity in a way that we in the United States, where there's so much more Christian privilege, we've had difficulty doing that. And so it's interesting to be able to look at these different cultural expressions of the church in other parts of the world and the ways in which maybe they're doing something a little bit better than we're doing it. And just to learn from them as well, because they have so much to contribute. Is it okay for me to actually say something about the reparations question quickly? I just wanted to mention this because I sort of felt distant from this whole idea of reparations, partly because my parents came to the United States at a time when there was more prosperity available to them, unlike some of my Japanese American friends and colleagues, or Chinese American friends and colleagues who've had a very different experience from my own family. But when I think about reparations and I think about the ways in which maybe we balance things out, I think that I've found a connection point. I didn't understand the reason why the presiding bishop and others, and I don't want to say this too loudly, but I'll be honest, the presiding bishop and others were suggesting that we have alternative paths for ordination. If people heard my story, their mouths just drop, because every point of the way was a little bit more difficult than it needed to be. And I guess I just have grown accustomed to that. That feels like a norm for me. I just accept it at this point. I'm not sure that that's the best way to respond, but it's helping me cope. And I think to myself, yes, there is a reason to do that. And when I think about people from unique backgrounds and backgrounds that are not represented in the church, let's say Pakistani Americans and Pakistani Christians, there is a way in which when God is calling out people for a particular call, maybe the fact that that person from a tiny group is specifically called by God because they're not represented, and there is representation that's necessary, representation that's important. For the sake of others, in Pakistan, women are not allowed to be ordained, and that actually limits pastoral care and sacramental celebration and sacramental administration to women in prisons and in hospitals, where there's gender segregation, so men cannot go into these spaces. So who's going to offer sacrament of the sick to a woman who's very, very ill in a certain segregated space? So I say this, it's a longer conversation, But I'm thinking to myself that when God is calling out people from underrepresented communities, Indigenous communities, our Black communities, our Caribbean communities, South Asian communities, Southeast Asian communities, any community, that maybe there's a way in which we recognize, and part of our reparation in a process in understanding systemic oppression and reversing it is to recognize that a person who may be called out from one of those communities may be someone who, that's the discernment. The reality is that why would that person be called out to this work, apart from the fact that God needs for this specific person with this specific background to be present to these people? And so I think I'm understanding that a little bit differently. And I hope that someday when I'm in a place to be able to be on committees and give more of a voice, that some of what I've learned from my own exceptionally challenging experience is something that can be a gift to someone else and to communities in general. But I've just learned a little bit more about that. And I think part of reparation in the ordination process and in this process of reversing systemic oppression is understanding that the discernment may have happened at an earlier place. And so maybe we need to identify that and understand that the process is going to look different because there's a discernment that's happened slightly differently.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I gotta lift that up. That was that's just such an awesome, amazing, beautiful point, Shanta. That I mean that echoes like some parts of my own call, and I think speaks to part of what I was thinking a little bit about the other question as well. But when I thought of reparations, I immediately jumped to reparations for Japanese Americans or reparations for Chinese Americans, because I don't feel like, I don't want to speak for all Koreans, but I don't feel like Koreans are generally are owed anything, coming in, and later waves of immigration where prosperity is much more available. So perhaps for the Koreans that worked on the sugar plantations in Hawaii long ago. But lifting up voices, yeah, that to me that sort of answers both of those last questions that we've been talking about. Continue to lift up voices, like incorporating more of our saints and holy women and holy men, lifting up those voices so we can help create spaces, safe spaces and brave spaces for people to continue to lift up their voices, so stories are heard, not just in our liturgies, but on the ground. Are we able to create community spaces somehow that are safe and brave for people to be able to share their stories and have their voices heard? So there's no urge or need to assimilate in any way. And part of that work is incumbent upon others of us who can help create that space and help preach that word that, and forgive me for not remembering who says it, but none of us are free until all of us are free, right? There's still so much of that sentiment in our churches, in our circles, in our communities, in our society, that if a person of color has a moment, if they have the spotlight, if they have the microphone, the pulpit, whatever, that's taken away from the dominant, the overarching society of white people. But the reality is that's helping us get to that greater reality. And if we're going to be serious about being part of the Jesus movement, if we're serious about being a Catholic church, as an Anglican church, then we have to realize that we are that big tent. We have the room, we have the resources to be able to hold all of this and to be able to move forward together and realize that everyone's liberation is tied up with everyone else's.
And also I want to add on this, like in doing this work, we also need to remember about all the intersectionality. You cannot do racism work without looking at how the other marginalized people are being oppressed, not just people, skin of our color, social, economic, gender, all the different spectrum. so one of the questions I always kind of wrestle with is that very recently, the outside consultant, our congregation has completed a racial justice audit, and the outside consultant came to deliver the final reports a few weeks ago. And sitting at a table, we were talking about, you know, whiteness. What does whiteness means? And whiteness is not an attack on people of the white European descent. We are talking about social construct that holds power and how decisions are being made. So a very interesting conversation that came out was that, you know, oh my gosh, you know, in our faith formation, in our children's education, are we perpetuating a white God? Or are we perpetuating a white Jesus? And that really caused me to think about, we really need to take a careful look at all our faith formation programs. Is that, what are we teaching our children? Are we teaching a very white God? Are we telling them stories that our children cannot see themselves, you know, in the story? And I'm very glad to see that Godly Play Foundation has done a fabulous job lately in revamping a lot of the curriculum. They have added new stories, including Martin Luther King Jr. and Barbara Harris, you know, stories into Godly Play curriculum. And it's really an attempt to move away from this construct of a God who is white. And not a God of Moses who were in the midst of delivering the people who were oppressed. And so I think that there's a lot of intersectionality that we need to look at when we talk about, you know, our faith formation, our liturgy, and engaging in this racial justice work.
Thank you for sharing. Before we move on to the final question, before we take some of the questions from those in our audience here, are there any final thoughts about the reparations piece? Most of you all spoke on it anyway, but.
My only thing I want to add is, you know, as a member of the Japanese community, my father did receive a check for that reparations, and he was pretty cynical about it. I think most Japanese Americans were, because that doesn't change anything. It doesn't change relationships. It doesn't change consciousness. It doesn't allow the community I grew up in Hood River, to be reconciled with each other, to even face into the history. And so I think the idea of reparations, it shifts and changes depending on the community and the effect intended and the way in which it's received. So I don't want to discount the fact that an economic repair can have a meaningful and significant impact, but it can't take the place of repairing relationships, and it can't take the place of repairing a community. And that is really the more costly work. And that is really where we need to invest.
Yes.
Poignant, very well said. Thank you for that. That's going to resonate with me, as well as what all of you have shared. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and start placing them in the Q&A section. We're going to just ask this final question here. Panelists, what are your general thoughts anyway about celebrating Asian American and Pacific Islander Month?
You know, at first I thought it was kind of, you know, every time I open up social media and stuff and it says, oh, today's National Pancake Day or something, you know, I thought it was kind of flippant. I don't usually observe all of the today's, you know, left-handed day or something, you know, but I was kind of happy after a while when I thought about how Asian, and that's a large part of the world. The other part of the world is really never celebrated in this country, and the contributions, the artists, the leaders, we've had several. I do have this pet peeve of when people say, oh, he was the first Asian senator, or the first Asian gold medalist in the Olympics. You know, that always makes me mad because of that, those things where you just keep recognizing that the breakthrough of a group of people is always put in the context of the achievements of white people who have had all those other opportunities. But this time, like the other day I was looking, I mean, I'm really happy that that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders get a whole month. And because the other day I was looking for baseball on TV and I found Crazy Rich Asians, the movie was playing. And that's just such a great movie, you know, where that totally underrepresented in the arts, but to see a joyful movie like that. So I've changed my mind, you know, maybe from now on, I'll also be paying attention to National Poodle Day or something.
I have friends who watched the Crazy Rich Asian and and they knew I was from Singapore, so they asked me, "Are your family crazy rich?" I say, "No, they're just crazy, not rich." But that was a great movie. But I'm also glad to see that in the light of what our conversation have been, is that AAPI community has very often been very invisible. And so I'm glad to see that we actually are lifting up the visibility of AAPI communities. I think this is, so I really so appreciative that the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing actually, you know, invited us to speak on this topic. So thank you.
Yeah. So Alan, I want to say something about that as the director of the center, that I agree with you that it's good to be doing this, but I also, as a Black woman, am totally committed to the notion that we have got to learn to live better than that, so that we're not designated months for people, but that we are clear that everybody's here and everybody's equal, and that we need to be paying attention to people all the time. And so even though we took the opportunity at the center to go with this national designation or whatever it is, part of me resists that whole idea, the same as I resist Black History Month. I dislike February as Black History Month because we're here 12 months to the year and not just 11. So, and I want to be on record saying that everybody needs to be considered as a viable part of the larger community all of the time. And we should learn how to celebrate each other. We really should learn how to know about each other so we don't have to pick a month to celebrate. You know, that we already understand and know what the contributions are, and we appreciate everybody. And the church is a place where we need to be doing that, if any place is going to do it, because we've already claimed to be one. You know, I mean, that's that whole theological framework, and then yet we separate everybody out. And so while on the one hand, you're glad not to be invisible the whole year, but it's on the other hand, don't get too happy about it until it gets to be done, all the time. Like I say all the time to people who get so excited about how many Asian congregations we've got or Latinx congregations. I said, I want to say, come and talk to me when you can tell me that the white people are meeting at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and the Asian or Latinx people are meeting at 11. Because you see, we have 11 o'clock service and it's white people. And then 5 o'clock, we have whatever that group is that we're so proud to say we have. Well, we need to not play a game about that. We need to start really owning that we still have these hierarchies that we can't justify. So while I'm so glad you came to be here with us today, but I want you to know we're committed to having more than a month where we talk about these issues. What I really want to see is us having all the groups that are struggling with oppression in one meeting, talking about what do we share in common and what are the similarities and how do we support one another so that we're not even singling out the conversation even this way. I mean, this is a good step forward, don't get me wrong, but it is a process, and this is a tiny, tiny step And I don't want people to get too happy about it because we've got a long journey ahead of us and we need to stay very vigilant about it. I guess that's the big point I want to make.
Well, I think it's efforts like these, Dr. Meeks, that lift up designated months like these. I tend to be a little suspicious of them, like Barbara. What I like about these kinds of panels is they aren't a two-dimensional celebration, meaning it's about clothes and food and music, which is, fine. But those are kind of, a chance to have a theme party, as opposed to let's have some really honest conversations and lift up the entire story.
Yes.
Thank you.
I wanted to mention that I so appreciate what Dr. Meeks had to say, and Bishop Akiyama as well, that it's interesting. I wasn't entirely sure why May was designated a month to honor Asian American Pacific Islander heritage. And so I looked it up, and I'm ashamed to say I didn't know that before this, but I looked it up and I could see that it's really rooted in an understanding of oppression experienced by Japanese American and Chinese American communities at the early part of the 20th century. And I'm aware of that. I think here in Dallas, there's a Human Rights Museum, and they actually do a wonderful exhibit really talking about the contributions of these communities, the ways in which people worked against oppression as well. And so I'm grateful to have that awareness. And I think it's been important for me to understand the privilege with which my family came to the United States. And at the same time, to recognize that that month and that experience of coming to the United States and having experiences of systemic oppression and racism, it may not be the same experience across Asian communities. Certainly, I think the month of August tends to be a month for South Asians to feel a little bit more represented because of the historical experience of the separation between India and Pakistan, and the idea that that's when the Independence Day is. So there tend to be a lot of ceremonies, whether people are Hindu or Muslim or Christian. There's an awareness that there was a change at that time. And so I think it's really important to be able to lift up the reasons why this month was designated. I certainly learned something from it, and I think it's important, and that will carry me through, in months in the future. If I'm preaching and it's the first week in May, to certainly say something and to talk a little bit about historical experiences of oppression for some communities within the AAPI community, and then others that have experienced privilege. But not all have experienced privilege, because when I think about the Pakistani American community and some South Asian communities, it was actually post 9/11 that many communities were targeted in the same way. Our current Asian communities are experiencing targeting in New York City and other places. They're being scapegoated because of certain dynamics. For us, it was because of terrorism. For others, it's because of a pandemic. And so there are ways in which there's some similar dynamics that unite us, and the ways in which we experience oppression, maybe under certain circumstances throughout history.
Thank you. For any of the panelists, the question says, what has been some of the costs or gains to your sense of self-identity as you have navigated predominantly white structures to get you to your current place in life and professionally? Yes, I'll repeat that. What has been some of the costs or gains to your sense of self-identity as you have navigated predominantly white structures to get to, essentially to get to where you are in life?
I think, that's a book. We each have a book to write the question. But the thing that comes to my mind right now is there are, of all the interweavings of the costs and the gains, for me, the church has been the center point. And by that, I don't mean that my entire life I went to church every single Sunday, but my understanding of always faith and the possibility for healing and transformation has always been a part of how I have understood everything that I have suffered and celebrated. And so in many ways, I would say the church helped me make what has been a cost a gain, to transform the pain and the wounding and the brokenness into something that has been transformative and light-giving and loving.
Mhm. Mhm.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that?
I think it's something that I think maybe touched on earlier, but it's one of those things that we constantly think about. It's something that a question that is always in our minds. For me, like having grown up in very white places and spaces with not a lot of sense of who I am or was as a Korean, finding a Korean church in the Episcopal Church, and then going through the process of discernment and ordination has helped me gain my sense of self by knowing more of who I am and who I'm not along the way. So that's been one benefit.
I think for me, I used to be, very tentative and just very quiet and sit back and listen to what other people have to say. I think that is still important. We have to always take a posture of listening, not assuming that we know better than anybody else, because in doing racial justice work, it is one relationship at a time. If you don't take time to listen and sit with people, that work is not possible. I think one of the gains is that it really, once you have experienced the oppression and the wounding, it really compels you to look at the church as a system. And in order to effect a system, that is where our work needs to do, which is the reason why I'm very passionate about church governance. And because it's not that we can fix racism through church governance. There's no way we can do that. But that is where all the relationships are being built. That is where we can start to have conversation and to do some truth telling. And to repair those wounds and repair those relationships, because part of earlier when we talked about reparation is not just about money. It's really about repairing. What can we do to make that relationship right? And very often we want to do truth telling and we want to go straight to reconciliation, but we're not willing to do the reparation, which is the repairing of that broken relationship. So I think that in that process, I have really gained a lot of personal growth of recognizing my own racialized trauma and what that looks like and what kind of work that I need to take to be able to be a gift to the world. Because if we walk around with our shadow and not able to recognize those wounds, that is when we go back out there to wound other people. And so I think that in this process, I have really gained a lot by recognizing those.
Yes.
I think that's particularly profound, and we appreciate you sharing, because actually the next question spoke to that exactly. And the person was asking, do you feel that you are still asking the church and society to see you as a gift and not a burden or irrelevant when offering contributions to society?
If I could share, I certainly experienced my diocese and others who've been supportive to me along the way as seeing me as a gift to the church. I think that this may not be related, but one of my friends who's a priest, who's a native Texan, was a former colleague at a parish where I was working, said, out of the same pain that we've shared in some experiences, said, I'm learning to look at Jesus and not focus on the church. The church is a wounded place. It's a place that's broken. And I too am sort of seeing it that way, that part of God's work of healing and repair is part of the work that God is doing in each one of us to work into the church, that type of healing. And so I guess there's a part of me that sees that, I do believe that I'm seen as a gift. And at the same time, I feel as if sometimes, and maybe this is the invisibility piece, it's understanding where we fit into the church and where we fit. What is that right place? And I think maybe that's just an experience. That's a process of figuring that out. But I think that for those of us who have unique backgrounds, unique gifts, unique heritage, there's a way in which the conversation about where we're going to fit and where we're going to go, especially in the beginning, needs to be crafted a little bit more. And it needs to be a partnered conversation about, what is my heritage? What is my background? And where do you see some of those opportunities? And how can we think about this might be unique, or there might be some specific needs that are important to attend to here. So I believe that people genuinely see many of us as gifts. I feel that way. I feel seen that way. It's trying to figure out what is that unique space for formation at this point that's going to be a healthy space to grow and to learn, which is not going to be the same space as someone who's part of the dominant majority, because there are a whole set of other issues at play that might be part of implicit bias, or part of unconscious bias, or part of a whole set of other issues that a person from a dominant background who may be in a position of leadership making those decisions may never have experienced and may not know.
Yeah, Reverend Shanta, I want to say that it's important. You have to be careful with that language, even because what does that mean? You're other, but you're gift. You got to be careful that you don't end up being the designated other that's now being kind of considered the exception. In the African American community, we worry a lot about something we call the exceptional Negro. So there's a little bit of edginess with that you've got to be a little careful about. You're a gift because God made you and you're here, period. But then we get into, well, you're so wonderful and basically you're so different. But then people different from what? And what is all that? You know what I mean? That if we get into assigning a set of traits that makes it better for you to be present than for your 10 sisters and 10 other people like you out there, that if those people had to be here, if the people wouldn't be quite as happy about their presence, but because you're so wonderful, you're the exception. And so I think I always want to be careful with that business of why am I a gift? I'm a gift because God's given me life, and it's good for me to be on the planet. And there's nobody else on the planet like me, period. That makes me a gift, not because I'm the nice Black woman that doesn't make you feel bad, So I just want to raise that because I'm just suspicious of how quickly we can degenerate into fixing our prejudices so we can tolerate them.
I appreciate that, Dr. Meeks. I certainly hear that, especially the last part that you shared, the whole idea that we are a gift because God created us and we're here on this earth. I think what I was sharing, just to specify, is that when there are so few people who represent communities that do need a certain type of ministry, maybe it's linguistic skills and others,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
recognizing that there's a very unique space that
Right.
that person can sort of occupy without the
Right.
exceptionalism. I completely agree with you,
Right.
omitting the exceptional piece because that's its own burden. But
Right.
it's recognizing that there's a unique constellation of skills and abilities that have a special place for whatever
Yes.
reason.
Absolutely. And my comment, let me be clear, was not really as much directed at what you have said, what you were just saying, as at the general kind of culture, the white response to people of color. If you hear too much profusiveness about how wonderful you are, you might need to say, what is really going on here? So.
Thank you. That clarity was from both of you was very much so needed. And we don't have time to get into the other pieces. We only have about 2 minutes remaining here, and Dr. Meeks is going to give some closing remarks. But what's fascinating about what both of you shared is the other part of the question, which was, what is the difference between seeing a person as a gift versus tokenism?
Yeah.
And so, but again, both of you just basically spoke to that.
Yeah,
So, okay. So someone said, perhaps the difference between being a gift and having unique gifts due to one's heritage. Definitely worthy of further conversation, but we really appreciate, the questions still coming in. At this time, you all, we're going to pass the mic to our Executive Director, Dr. Meeks, and to answer your question, Bills. As far as using this as a teaching tool in your local parishes, please know that this recording will be available on YouTube for you to use how you'd like, and it will be available on the center's YouTube page. So it will be accessible to you in just a few days. Thank you.
And let me just say, in regards to resources, that the Center for Racial Healing website has 4 categories of African American, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian American and Pacific Islanders as categories where information is being cataloged. And we are doing that in an effort to try to be equitable in dealing with issues of race and oppression. Because, as one of my children pointed out, we refuse to play oppression Olympics. We are not trying to win any prize here for who is the most oppressed and singling out one group over and above another. We're in Georgia, and we're in Province 4. We're in the former slave states. I'm a Black woman leading this work. So I know more about Black-white stuff than I do anything else, but I have a responsibility to know about it all. And you don't get to pick and choose. So if you don't get to sit in your little corner somewhere and decide which little bitty piece of this issue you want to work with, and then just work with it and let that go. You've got to care about it all. You may not be able to do anything about all of it at the same time, but there's got to be a sense of care and understanding how things intersect, or else we just kind of missing the point. Any of God's children that are not being treated right needs to concern every one of God's children. And if we're not doing that, particularly as people of faith, if we're not doing that, we're not being faithful, period. And so the Absalom Jones Center is trying very hard to be faithful. We're trying to be focused, and we're trying to be faithful. And this event tonight is only one tiny step. We have the categories, the information there. For the panelists, I want to invite you to send us resource materials, or anybody in the audience, if there are things that books that people can have to read, films, anything that that would be helpful or that you have found helpful, let us know, and we will be delighted to try to figure out how to include that. If you have program ideas or whatever, be in touch with us, because we're one family, and we ought to be a little bit more committed to trying to figure out how to live here together in peace. I do believe that the planet needs us to reimagine our life together in a way that makes it possible for us to see the face of God in everybody and be grateful for that experience of seeing the face of God. So I'm so grateful to all of you for saying yes to this invitation to come and be here tonight. And you can count on us bugging you some more. So just listen out for some other things, because we're not done. And I do want to have events, not events, but programs where we're talking about the intersections and that we are bringing people from all the groups together. So, because we don't even want to get into doing the groups individually and making it look like there's no way to cross share, because there's an absolute, oppression is one kind of energy system. And no matter where it comes up, it's the same thing. It's just lived out sometimes differently, but it's the same thing, the effort to control somebody and take away their freedom. So this has been wonderful, and thank you. And thank you, audience, for joining us. And you will get the recording in a little while. Dominique will send that out to everybody. Please go and visit our website. Please interact with us. Please use anything you find there to help advance this conversation, because everything depends on it. I mean, it's our work. It is the work we have to do. And thank you for being engaged in it and caring about it and helping us to do it a little bit better. And I would just encourage you all to be just a half a shade braver every day. So thank you.